I still remember the smell of roasted chicken and garlic butter that night. It was supposed to be just another family dinner, harmless, polite, maybe even healing. I hadn't seen everyone together in months, and part of me still believed that somehow we could fix things. I had rehearsed in my head what I'd say, how I'd smile, how I wouldn't bring up old wounds. I wanted peace, not attention. We sat around the table, my mother at the head, my father carving the meat like he always did. My brother Daniel sat across from me, the golden boy, perfectly pressed shirt, watch gleaming under the warm light. His wife laughed at something trivial, and my parents' faces softened, proud, indulgent. I smiled faintly, pretending not to notice how no one asked how I'd been, how work was going, or if I was happy. When the conversation shifted to the upcoming family reunion, my heart lifted. It had been years since we'd all gathered, and for a moment, I let myself imagine belonging again. I took a breath and said, almost timidly, "Just tell me when the reunion is. I'll make sure to be there this time." Daniel's fork froze midair, his lips twisted into that familiar smirk that always meant something cruel was coming. He leaned back, eyes scanning me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. "You're not invited," he said casually, the words slicing through the room like glass. "You don't belong anymore." The air turned heavy. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. My father cleared his throat, staring down at his plate. No one said a word. I felt the blood rush to my face, hot and sharp, as if shame itself were burning me alive. My brother's wife hid a grin behind her napkin, and I caught it. That quick flash of satisfaction that told me this had been planned. For a few seconds, I just sat there, frozen between disbelief and humiliation. Then I laughed softly, the kind of laugh people make when they're trying not to cry. "I see," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Good to know where I stand." Daniel shrugged. "You made your choices," he said. "We just decided not to pretend anymore." I wanted to scream, to ask what choices he meant. Sacrificing my own dreams to take care of our parents when he was too busy building his empire. The nights I stayed awake helping Mom through her depression while he sent flowers instead of visiting, but I didn't. I just stared at him and realized that this was never about family. It was about control. My mother mumbled something about keeping the peace, but the words fell flat. The silence that followed was worse than the insult. It was the sound of everyone agreeing, even if they didn't say it. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape echoing louder than anything else in the room. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly. My hands trembled as I picked up my coat. No one stopped me. Not even my mother looked up. Outside, the cold air hit my face and I breathed it in like medicine. I stood there for a while, staring through the restaurant window at the family that had decided I didn't belong. Inside, they laughed again, as if nothing had happened. For years, I had believed that silence kept the peace, that if I stayed quiet, they'd love me more. But standing there in the dark parking lot, I understood something new. Silence doesn't bring peace when it's forced. It only feeds their comfort. That was the night something broke inside me. Not my heart, exactly, but the illusion that I was part of them. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just turned, walked to my car, and drove away without looking back. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was done trying. But deep down, as the headlights cut through the night, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not sorrow. It was resolve. That dinner didn't just humiliate me, it redefined me. Growing up, Daniel's name was always said with warmth. Mine was usually an afterthought. Daniel got an A again. Daniel's teacher says he's gifted. Daniel's team won regionals. Each praise for him was a gentle reminder that my efforts were invisible. I wasn't jealous back then, just hopeful. I believed if I kept being patient, they'd notice me too, but they never did. When Daniel got his first car at 16, Dad handed him the keys with pride shining in his eyes. "He's earned it," he said, ignoring that I was already working part-time after school to help pay bills. My birthday came 2 weeks later. They forgot. I baked my own cake that night, tiny, uneven, frosted with the last bit of sugar we had left. I remember sitting alone at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering, whispering to myself, maybe next year. It became a rhythm. Me sacrificing, him celebrated. When Mom fell ill during my college years, Daniel sent flowers and apologies from out of state. I left school to take care of her. "You're such a good daughter," they said, but the praise was hollow. There was no help, no gratitude that lasted, just expectation. When Mom recovered, she told everyone how Daniel's flowers lifted her spirits. My nights of nursing her through fever didn't make it into the story. The small injustices piled up quietly. Like dust, no one bothers to clean. Every Christmas, Daniel's gifts gleamed under the tree. Gadgets, suits, something expensive and thoughtful. Mine were practical. Socks, shampoo, a dish towel once. When I got my first promotion, I called home, excited, breathless. Dad chuckled and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Guess Daniel's influence rubbed off on you." He didn't even ask what my job was. I used to think maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe love just looked different for me. But over time, the evidence became impossible to ignore. When family photos were taken, I was always at the edge. When decisions were made, I wasn't asked, just informed. Even the house had Daniel's presence carved into it. His trophies still polished on the shelf. His childhood drawings framed in the hallway, while my paintings were stored in a dusty box in the garage. Once, I overheard Mom on the phone with a relative. "Daniel's doing so well." "We're so proud," she said, her tone glowing. Then came the pause. "Oh, and yes, she's fine too. Still single, still working." I stood frozen in the hallway, the words cutting deeper than any insult could. To them, I was a footnote, a placeholder. But the worst moment came the day Dad retired. He called a family dinner to celebrate, full of laughter and speeches. At the end, he handed Daniel a small velvet box. Inside was his old watch, the same one he'd promised to pass down to whoever stood by him the most. I waited for acknowledgement, for some recognition that I'd been the one who stood by him every day, through every difficult moment. But his eyes didn't even flick toward me. "You deserve it, son," he said. And just like that, another invisible piece of me faded. I learned not to ask for fairness, because fairness didn't exist in our house. I learned to swallow resentment with a smile, to make myself small enough not to disturb their comfort. Whenever Daniel failed, they called it a learning curve. Whenever I stumbled, it became proof she's not responsible enough. Years later, when people said, "Family is everything," I wanted to laugh. Family had taught me that love could be conditional, that loyalty could be one-sided, that you could pour your heart out for people who never once looked back. But there were tiny moments, too, small rebellions that no one noticed. The nights I stayed up reading instead of sulking, teaching myself skills they said I'd never need. The day I moved out without asking for help. The first time I looked in the mirror and said, "You don't need their approval to exist." Still, even after all that, a part of me kept hoping things might change. That maybe Daniel would one day see how hard I'd tried, that Mom and Dad would realize what they'd done. I held on to that foolish hope longer than I'd admit, until that dinner. That moment when Daniel looked at me and said I didn't belong. It wasn't just an insult. It was confirmation of every unspoken truth I'd carried my whole life. And as much as it broke something inside me, it also freed me. Because finally I understood. I'd spent years waiting for validation from people who had already decided I wasn't worth seeing. For a long, heavy moment after Daniel said it, "You're not invited. You don't belong anymore." No one spoke. The words hung above the table like smoke, bitter and suffocating. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, my pulse loud in my ears. I half expected someone, anyone, to laugh and say he was joking. But they didn't. Dad sipped his wine as if nothing had happened. Mom's eyes flicked nervously between us before she finally spoke. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said lightly. "Daniel didn't mean it." "Didn't mean it?" The smirk on his face told another story. He knew exactly what he was saying, and worse, he knew they'd let him. The laughter resumed, forced and shallow. My stomach twisted. I could taste the humiliation, sharp and metallic, as I swallowed hard, pretending the food still had flavor. I smiled weakly, trying to appear unbothered, while inside something fragile cracked. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, Mom's gentle interruptions cut me off. "Let's not ruin dinner," she whispered once, as if I were the problem. Daniel went on telling stories about his new project, his voice filling the space mine wasn't allowed to occupy. They laughed. They toasted him. I faded into the background again, like I always had. Except this time I could feel the vanishing in real time. I tried to steady my breath, but the humiliation had a heartbeat. It pulsed through my veins, warm and cruel. I glanced at the wineglass before me, wondering if it would help dull the ache in my chest. But I couldn't bring myself to drink. I didn't want anything that came from that table anymore. Mom turned to me near the end, her tone artificially sweet. "You know we love you, right?" It was the kind of question that didn't want an answer. I nodded because that's what was expected. But inside I felt something shift. The tiny piece of hope that had survived all these years, the one that still believed things might someday be different, finally withered. When the check came, I quietly excused myself, muttering something about being tired. Nobody tried to stop me. Daniel didn't even look up. As I stepped outside, the restaurant's warm light spilled onto the pavement, but the world beyond was drenched in rain. Cold, relentless rain that soaked through my coat within seconds. I didn't run for cover. I let it fall. Each drop felt like a truth washing over me. Every unspoken slight, every moment of being overlooked. I walked slowly down the street, the sound of laughter fading behind me, replaced by the soft rhythm of rain against the sidewalk. My reflection in the puddles looked like a stranger, someone who had finally run out of reasons to keep forgiving. For years, I'd believed leaving the table meant giving up on them, that walking away was failure. But as the rain clung to my skin, I realized it might be the first honest thing I'd done in a long time. I didn't belong at that table. I never had, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. When I woke the next morning, the world felt strangely quiet, as if even the air knew something had ended. My phone buzzed with messages from Mom, half-hearted attempts to smooth things over. "Don't take Daniel's words so seriously." He was joking. "We love you." Each one felt like salt pressed into a fresh wound. For the first time, I didn't reply. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, then turned the phone off. That silence was my answer. I didn't announce I was going no contact. There was no confrontation, no dramatic declaration, just absence. I stopped calling, stopped showing up for holidays, stopped trying to be the bridge between people who had long since burned theirs with me. At first, the silence felt unbearable, like withdrawal from a drug I'd mistaken for love. But eventually, it became something else. Peace. I poured my energy into myself instead. I picked up extra shifts at the diner where I worked, saving every spare dollar. I signed up for night classes, even when exhaustion made my vision blur. The loneliness that once crushed me became a strange kind of motivation. Each long shift, each exam, each small success whispered, "You're building something of your own now." There were moments when I missed them. Mom's humming in the kitchen, Dad's rare but genuine laughter, even Daniel's teasing before it turned cruel. But missing them didn't mean I wanted to return. Missing was just proof that I was healing in real time, that I could acknowledge the ache without letting it define me. The first milestone came when I launched a small online store, selling handmade candles and bath oils I crafted late at night. It started as therapy, but within months, orders trickled in steadily. Every sale was a small rebellion, a quiet victory that didn't need their validation. I found joy in the independence, waking up early, setting my own schedule, not waiting for anyone's permission to feel proud. There was a strange beauty in the routine. The mornings filled with coffee and sunlight, the quiet hum of progress replacing the noise of disappointment. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like a background character in someone else's story. I was writing my own, word by word, paycheck by paycheck, dream by fragile dream. Sometimes I'd pass a family eating together in a restaurant window, smiling, talking, clinking glasses, and for a split second, my chest would tighten. But then I'd remember that appearances lie. Once I'd been the one smiling too, swallowing hurt behind practiced laughter. Now my silence was honest. It spoke of boundaries, of growth, of choosing peace over performance. Months turned into a year. The messages stopped coming. Birthdays passed unnoticed on both sides. Strangely, I didn't feel abandoned anymore. I felt free. The version of me who used to beg for acknowledgement was gone, washed away with that night's rain. In her place stood someone quieter, steadier, no longer desperate to prove her worth. They thought my silence was weakness, but it was the loudest thing I'd ever said. It had been nearly 5 years since I'd heard a word from any of them when the first whisper found me. I was packaging candle orders one quiet afternoon when an old classmate messaged me, her tone hesitant. "Hey, isn't your brother Daniel the guy in that business article? Looks like his company's not doing so great." My stomach tightened. Against my will, I clicked the link. There it was. His company under investigation for financial mismanagement, layoffs, lawsuits, headlines dripping with scandal. I should have felt triumphant. For years, he'd treated me like I was beneath him, unworthy of belonging. But instead, I just felt hollow. The silence I'd built between us cracked slightly, letting in a chill I hadn't felt in a long time. A week later, another message arrived, this time from a distant cousin. Mom had been in and out of the hospital. Dad's health was failing too. I stared at the screen, pulse thudding. They hadn't reached out, not once. And now that everything was collapsing, I was supposed to care. Still, at night, memories came back uninvited. Mom brushing my hair when I was little, Dad carrying me to bed after I'd fallen asleep on the couch. For all their favoritism, they were still my parents. The thought twisted something deep inside me. Compassion and resentment tangled until I couldn't tell one from the other. I walked through my apartment that evening, the scent of lavender wax thick in the air, and wondered what kind of person I wanted to be now. The old me would have rushed to help, hoping to earn gratitude that would never come. The new me wasn't sure. Would helping them mean I'd finally forgiven? Or that I'd betrayed the version of myself who had survived without them? As days passed, their names kept surfacing. Mutual acquaintances dropped hints, as if testing my reaction. "Your brother's lost everything," one said quietly. "Your parents might lose their house." Every word felt like a ghost brushing past, whispering old pain back to life. I caught my reflection in the shop window one afternoon, hair tied up, hands stained with wax, eyes steadier than they used to be, and realized I wasn't that desperate girl anymore. But part of me still longed for closure, for one conversation that would make sense of the years of silence. By the end of that week, I sat alone on my couch, the city lights flickering through the blinds, phone in hand. My thumb hovered over Mom's contact before I set it down again. Not yet, maybe not ever. Some things I realized echo louder when unanswered. The news spread fast, but the reality hit me slowly. Daniel, the golden child, the family's pride, was falling. His company, once flaunted at every dinner table and social gathering, was collapsing under the weight of lawsuits and unpaid debts. I read article after article, each headline more damning than the last. Investors were pulling out, former employees were speaking up, and for the first time in his life, my brother's name wasn't followed by admiration. It was followed by scandal. I wish I could say I didn't care. But part of me did. Not out of pity, but disbelief. Daniel had always landed on his feet, protected by privilege, by our parents' endless justifications. Watching him stumble felt surreal, like the universe had finally noticed the imbalance I'd lived under for so long. Soon after, I heard that Mom and Dad were struggling too. Their savings, once a source of comfort and superiority, were tied up in Daniel's failing business. The house I'd grown up in, the same one I'd been told I didn't deserve to visit, was suddenly in danger of repossession. My childhood memories, the scent of lilacs from the backyard, the creak of the stairs where I used to sit and listen to their laughter, were now attached to a foreclosure notice. A neighbor from my old street called me, her voice cautious. "Honey, I don't want to meddle, but they might lose the place soon. Your parents aren't doing well." I thanked her quietly, heart pounding, mind torn between old pain and a flicker of compassion I didn't want to admit. I sat on my small apartment balcony that night, candles flickering around me, and tried to imagine their faces. The shock, the desperation, the way pride must be dissolving into fear. Once they had everything: comfort, reputation, and a daughter they considered disposable. Now they had each other and ruins. Part of me wondered if this was karma finally doing her rounds. I should have felt satisfaction, but instead I felt uneasy, like witnessing justice in slow motion but not knowing whether to cheer or mourn. Still, there was something undeniably poetic about it. The same house where I'd been humiliated for not being enough was about to slip from their grasp. The same brother who mocked me for working low-class jobs was now rumored to be borrowing money just to survive. For the first time in years, I felt the power dynamic tilt, not out of vengeance but balance. The scales were finally even. The call came on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that already felt heavy. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something in me hesitated. When I answered, the sound that met me wasn't what I expected. It was my mother's voice, trembling and small. "Sweetheart," she said, and the word hit me like an echo from another life. For a moment, I couldn't speak. She filled the silence with tears, the kind that came too late. "We need your help," she choked out. "Your father's been ill and Daniel, he's lost everything. The bank, they're taking the house." I listened quietly, letting her words wash over me. Years ago, I'd have rushed in to comfort her, desperate for any scrap of affection, but now I stayed still, grounded in the calm I'd built from nothing. Her voice cracked, pleading, "Please, I don't know what to do." In my mind, I saw that dinner table, the way Daniel smirked, the way she'd excused him. The same woman who once told me I didn't belong was now begging me to come back. The symmetry of it all felt almost cinematic. I took a slow breath. "I'll think about it," I said softly. My tone wasn't angry or cold. It was composed, deliberate. The power had shifted, and we both felt it. There was silence on her end, broken only by a shaky sigh. "You sound different," she whispered. "I am," I replied simply. When the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the dark phone screen. I expected guilt to rise, but instead there was only stillness, a strange, steady sense of balance. I hadn't slammed the door, but I hadn't opened it either. For the first time, I realized I could choose what they once decided for me. That night, the rain tapped gently against my window, just like it had years ago when I walked away from that dinner humiliated. Only this time, I wasn't the one standing outside. I'd always believed silence was my weakness, but over the years, it had become my greatest weapon. While my family paraded wealth, I learned how to build it quietly. Every long night working, every dollar I refused to waste, every decision I made without asking for approval, it all compounded into something stronger than pride: independence. When I started my business, I never imagined it would grow beyond my tiny apartment. But word spread, orders multiplied, and soon I was shipping to boutiques across the country. I'd learned to keep my success low profile. People like my brother thrived on attention. I thrived on control. The first time I saw my balance cross 6 figures, I cried. Not because of the money, but because it meant I would never need to beg again. I had turned neglect into momentum. My parents and Daniel had spent years convincing me I was insignificant. Now, I was quietly thriving in the blind spot they'd created. A month after Mom's call, curiosity drew me to the bank that had handled their mortgage. I told myself it was just to check on things, maybe to prepare for what might happen next. But as I stood in that polished, air-conditioned lobby, surrounded by the quiet hum of efficiency, an idea began to take shape, dangerous, thrilling, and poetic. I asked to speak with a representative about the property. The banker, a courteous woman in a navy suit, recognized the address immediately. "That house is set for foreclosure next week," she said. "Are you related?" The word hung in the air. Related. I almost laughed. "In a way," I said. She explained the numbers, the outstanding debt, the timeline. As she spoke, I saw flashes of my childhood: the cracked front porch, the rose bushes Mom used to trim, the window seat where I'd read books to escape their arguments. That house had been my prison and my refuge, and now, for the first time, I could reclaim it, not through pleading, but purchase. I nodded slowly. "I'd like to buy it," I said. The banker's eyebrows lifted. Are you sure? It's in rough shape, and it will go up for auction soon. I'm sure, I replied, sliding my business card across the table. The process took weeks, but I handled it in silence. I signed documents, transferred funds, and when the final approval came through, I drove to the house and stood outside as the sun dipped low behind the roofline. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown, the place worn and weary, like it carried the weight of all the words that had been shouted within its walls. But it was mine now. Not as a daughter begging for belonging, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself from the scraps they left behind. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not Daniel. I let them believe the house was gone. It was better that way. Power doesn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it's stronger in the quiet. That night, I unlocked the front door for the first time in a decade. Dust hung in the air like ghosts. I walked through each room, my footsteps echoing softly. The dining room, the site of so many humiliations, felt smaller than I remembered. I ran my hand along the table where Daniel once sneered at me and whispered, "You were wrong." I stood in the living room, where my father's old chair still sat, and whispered a promise to myself. This house would no longer be a monument to pain. It would be proof that I had survived them. As I turned off the lights and stepped outside, I locked the door behind me and smiled faintly. They'd never know who saved it from strangers, and one day, when they came looking for shelter, they'd stand on my porch without realizing whose name was written on the deed. The envelope arrived in the mail like a ghost from the past, cream-colored, embossed and sealed with gold lettering that screamed pretense. I almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another promotional gimmick. But when I saw the return address, Daniel's new consulting firm, I froze. My pulse quickened. Curiosity won. Inside was an invitation. The Morgan family reunion. A night to celebrate resilience, reconnection, and renewal. Beneath the grand words, my brother's name gleamed as the host. I read it twice, laughter bubbling up in disbelief. The same man who'd once spat that I didn't belong was now orchestrating a family reunion. And under the guise of sentimentality, I could practically smell the desperation for investor attention. I sat at my kitchen table, fingers tracing the edges of the paper. So this was his latest scheme, dressing failure in a tuxedo, hoping nostalgia might attract capital. The irony was delicious. Once, I'd begged to be part of this family. Now they were the ones extending an invitation, unaware how the tables had turned. For a moment, I let my mind wander back to that dinner. The sting of his words, my mother's silence, the rain that had soaked my hair as I walked away. That humiliation had been my breaking point, the moment I'd vowed never to chase their approval again. Now, here I was, quietly wealthier than all of them combined, holding an invitation to the very kind of event that once excluded me. I poured myself a cup of coffee, smiling faintly as steam curled into the air. The woman they remembered, the one who stayed quiet, who took the blame, who swallowed pain, was gone. If they wanted a reunion, they would get one, but not the kind they expected. That evening, I called the listed RSVP number. Daniel's assistant answered, her tone chipper but rehearsed. "Will you be attending, Ms. Morgan?" "Yes," I said, my voice calm, confident. "Please let them know. I wouldn't miss it for the world." When I hung up, a thrill ran through me. This wasn't revenge in the loud, cinematic sense. It was subtle, restrained. Power disguised as politeness. I'd show up not as the forgotten daughter, but as the silent architect of their salvation and their reckoning. As I folded the invitation back into its envelope, I caught my reflection in the window. I didn't look angry. I looked composed, untouchable. The girl who once asked timidly, "Just tell me when the reunion is," had finally received her answer. And this time, she'd be the one setting the tone. I smiled, a slow, knowing curve of my lips. "See you soon, Daniel," I murmured, and for the first time, I meant it. The The night of the reunion arrived crisp and clear, the air humming with the kind of tension that only nostalgia could summon. I stood before the mirror one last time, adjusting the gold clasp on my simple black dress. It wasn't ostentatious, just elegant, understated, the kind of beauty that didn't need to announce itself. My hair fell in soft waves, my expression calm but unreadable. Outside, the car waited, a sleek, charcoal sedan that purred rather than roared. I'd chosen it deliberately. Let them wonder how I afforded it. Let them guess. The driver opened the door, and as I slid into the leather seat, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. For years, they had dictated the terms of my existence. Tonight, I was rewriting them. The venue was a rented estate on the outskirts of town, a modern glass structure pretending to be old money. As I arrived, the soft glow of chandeliers spilled across the courtyard. Guests mingled in clusters, their laughter light but strained, the way people laugh when pretending everything's fine. When I stepped out of the car, heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. It was subtle at first, a ripple, then a wave. I didn't have to smile. My presence alone disrupted their balance. The girl they had dismissed, underestimated, erased, now radiated calm control. Daniel stood near the entrance, his designer suit sharp, but his eyes hollowed by stress. For a moment, he didn't recognize me. Then I saw it, the flicker of realization, followed by the quick attempt to compose himself. "Sis?" he managed, forcing a grin. "Wow. You came." "I said I would," I replied smoothly. His laughter was nervous, brittle. "It's good to see you. Been too long." "Yes," I said, holding his gaze. "It has." The words hung in the air like fine glass, polished, delicate, dangerous if dropped. I walked past him, the click of my heels echoing in the marble foyer. The crowd subtly parted, as if instinctively making room for me. I could feel eyes following, curious, assessing, some envious. Inside, the decor screamed success, but the energy whispered survival. The food was lavish, the wine expensive, but beneath it all was desperation. Daniel's reunion was nothing more than a business pitch disguised as sentiment. He made his rounds, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, trying too hard. Occasionally, our eyes met across the room. Each time, his smile faltered. When the time came for his speech, he clinked his glass and thanked everyone for coming. His words dripped with self-praise and forced optimism, until he caught sight of me near the back of the room, arms loosely crossed, expression unreadable. For the first time, his voice wavered. He stumbled on a sentence, losing his rhythm. The audience didn't notice, but I did. The golden boy who once called me insignificant now trembled in his own spotlight. After the applause, he approached again, his tone more subdued. "Listen, I didn't know if you'd show, but I'm glad you did. Really." I tilted my head slightly. "I'm sure you are," I said, smiling faintly. He hesitated, then leaned in, almost whispering. "Maybe we can talk later. Catch up properly?" "Of course," I said, my voice warm but distant. "We'll talk soon." As he turned away, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall behind him. Serene, composed, untouchable. I wasn't the same sister who'd once stood trembling in their dining room, desperate for approval. I was the woman who now owned the very house they'd lost, the one thing they'd built their pride upon. The reversal was complete, but I didn't need to flaunt it. Power, I had learned, was most profound when it didn't need to prove itself. As the night drew on, I stepped out into the cool evening air, the muffled music fading behind me. Stars glittered above the estate, and I let myself smile, small, knowing, final. I had returned, not to reclaim a place in their world, but to remind myself I no longer needed one. The dining hall shimmered with golden light, glasses raised, chatter bubbling under the hum of a string quartet. The so-called Morgan family reunion had transformed into a showcase, Daniel's attempt to prove he was still in control, still the golden child. He stood at the head of the table, laughter rehearsed, charm stretched thin. I sat halfway down the table, perfectly still, the picture of quiet poise. My presence was an anomaly no one dared to question aloud. Dinner plates gleamed beneath the crystal chandeliers, conversation circling around polite flattery and business speculation. Every guest here was a potential investor, and Daniel was desperate to impress. The moment he lifted his glass, the room fell silent. "I want to make a toast," he announced, the confident host once again. "To family, our foundation, our future. And to new beginnings, new partnerships, and," he smiled widely, "to our new investors who've made tonight possible." A few scattered claps followed. I sipped my wine slowly, eyes steady on him. He continued, oblivious to the tightening air. "You all know the last few years have been challenging, but we Morgans always rise, and thanks to some brilliant new backers, our company's stronger than ever." His grin faltered for the briefest moment. "Some of you might even know them. They've been in the game longer than I have." A murmur rippled through the guests. I placed my glass down gently, the faint chime slicing through the quiet. "That's true," I said, my voice calm but commanding enough to draw every gaze. Daniel blinked. "Oh," he laughed nervously. "Didn't realize you were, interested in business talk." "Not usually," I said, standing. "But since you mentioned new investors, perhaps I should introduce myself properly." The guests exchanged confused looks. Daniel's jaw tightened. "I think everyone here already knows you're my sister," he said with a strained smile. "Yes," I replied evenly, "though I doubt they know that I'm also the majority shareholder of your company." The silence that followed was absolute. A fork clattered somewhere at the far end of the table. Daniel's color drained. "That's not," he started, but his voice cracked. "I acquired it last month," I said, eyes locked on him, "through a silent partnership deal with your former creditors. You remember? Those investors you failed to pay?" I turned to the room. They were quite eager to sell when the opportunity arose. Gasps echoed down the table. Someone coughed, another whispered, "She owns it." Daniel's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. That's impossible. "Oh, and one more thing," I said, my tone soft but sharp enough to cut. "This property you rented for the evening, the estate you're so proud to host this reunion in?" I paused, savoring the beat of stunned anticipation. "I bought it last week." The collective reaction was audible. Chairs creaking, hands covering mouths, eyes darting between us. Daniel stared at me as though seeing a ghost. I lifted my glass, the same calm smile never leaving my face. "To family," I said quietly. "Our foundation, our future." He didn't move. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. "Why?" he whispered, barely audible. I tilted my head. "Because once, you told me I didn't belong. Now, you're standing on my floor, eating at my table, running a company that signs my checks. I thought it was time we redefined what belonging means." The guests avoided his eyes, embarrassed for him. No one applauded this time. The silence was my standing ovation. I sat back down, unhurried, the hum of the quartet resuming as though nothing had happened. Around me, conversations faltered and restarted in cautious fragments. Daniel sank into his chair, face pale, eyes vacant. I didn't need to gloat. The room had already written the ending for me. The power that once humiliated me now sat quietly at my side, polished, patient, and absolute. I finished my wine, set the glass down, and smiled faintly to myself. Dinner again, but this time on my terms. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air itself. Daniel's face turned the color of chalk, his forced smile collapsing into a trembling grimace. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, their champagne glasses frozen mid-air. Every eye in the room was on him, the once untouchable golden child, now stripped of his illusion in front of everyone he'd tried to impress. He tried to laugh it off. "She's joking," he stammered, the words brittle and desperate. "You're all taking this way too seriously. I didn't move, didn't raise my voice." "It's not a joke, Daniel," I said softly, almost kindly. "The contracts are public. You can check." A murmur rippled across the table. Someone whispered, "She really owns it." Another leaned toward a friend, their eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel's composure fractured completely. "You planned this?" he snapped, pointing at me, voice breaking. "You wanted to humiliate me?" "No," I said, my tone still calm. "I just wanted you to know the truth. You said I didn't belong. I was just waiting for the right table." The words hung there, final and sharp, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. He froze. Then the laughter, his old, confident laugh, returned for a split second, but it came out hollow. His shoulders slumped. Around him, the guests shifted in discomfort, unwilling to look him in the eye. His wife stared down at her untouched glass, cheeks burning. I stepped back from the table. My pulse was steady. I wasn't trembling this time. I wasn't the desperate girl begging to be seen. I was the woman who no longer needed their validation. Only closure. "Excuse me," I said quietly, collecting my clutch from the side chair. "Enjoy your dinner." The sound of my heels against the marble was the only thing that moved in the silence. Behind me, I could hear the faint murmur of chaos beginning. Daniel pleading, trying to salvage something from the ruins of his pride. But the tone had changed. No one rushed to console him. The room that once revolved around his charm now spun in confusion and quiet shame. As I reached the door, my mother called after me, voice trembling, "Please, wait." I turned slightly, enough to meet her eyes. For a fleeting moment, I saw everything. The years of dismissal, the favoritism, the subtle wounds that had shaped me. And then I saw something else, regret. Real, raw regret, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. "I already did," I said gently. "For years." Then I walked out. The night air hit me like freedom, cool, sharp, cleansing. Music and voices faded behind the heavy doors. I crossed the courtyard slowly, the gravel crunching beneath my heels, the moonlight soft against the dark car waiting ahead. Inside, I took one last glance at the glowing windows of the estate, the stage of my humiliation and my rebirth. The roles had reversed, but the victory wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace. As the driver pulled away, I exhaled deeply. The sound was quiet, steady, like the closing of a chapter that had once defined me. Behind me, Daniel's empire, his pride, his image, his borrowed glory, crumbled under the weight of truth. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt infinite. Rain whispered against the windshield as I sat in the back seat, city lights blurring into streaks of gold and gray. The driver said nothing, and I didn't need him to. The silence was enough, deep, clean, and strangely beautiful. For the first time in years, I wasn't rehearsing what I wished I'd said, or imagining ways to prove myself. The noise inside me was gone. I thought about that first dinner, how small I'd felt when Daniel sneered that I didn't belong. Back then, silence had been my shield, my prison. I'd stayed quiet because no one listened, because speaking only invited more wounds. But tonight, that same silence had become something else entirely. It was power. It was peace. I realized I didn't hate them anymore. Not my mother for choosing him, not Daniel for his cruelty. They had built the story that shaped me, but they no longer defined it. I had turned every dismissal into drive, every insult into intention. They'd taught me what it meant to be invisible, and I'd learned how to thrive in plain sight. The car slowed at a red light. I looked out the window and saw my reflection, calm, collected, whole. For years I'd imagined revenge as fire, loud and consuming, but it turned out to be quiet. A slow, steady burn that didn't destroy, only illuminated. I leaned back, letting the soft hum of the engine carry me forward. My life no longer revolved around them. It expanded beyond them. They would remember tonight forever, but I wouldn't need to. As the light turned green, I whispered to myself, "It's over." Not in anger. Not in triumph, just truth. And with that, I let the past dissolve into the rain, silent, certain, and free. Months later, I stood before the house that had once been everything to me, my childhood fortress, the place that held both laughter and silence. The garden was overgrown now, but the scent of jasmine still lingered in the air. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the echo of my own footsteps greeting me like an old memory that no longer hurt. The living room was emptier than I remembered, yet somehow fuller, filled with the ghosts of what used to be. I carried a small frame wrapped in cloth, the photo from that long-ago dinner, the night everything fractured. I placed it gently on the mantelpiece. In the picture, we all smiled, the kind of smile that hides cracks deep enough to swallow love whole. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the silence breathe. It wasn't cold anymore. It felt sacred. The walls that once heard my shame now held my strength. I'd rebuilt myself piece by piece, and this house, this symbol of all I'd lost, was mine again. Not through revenge, but through resolve. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees and the faint hum of the city faded into dusk. I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. They had taken my voice once, but I'd learned to speak without words. I smiled softly, tracing the edge of the old frame with my fingertips. "Sometimes silence," I whispered, "is the loudest revenge." And with that, I turned off the lights, leaving the room bathed in twilight, peaceful, powerful, and finally, free.